Father God, we are so thankful to be here, to be together. God, I thank you for the women that are in this room, and God, that we're better all together than we are apart, and that just the diversity that's in this room in age and so many other places in life, that you draw us all together to study your word. And God, I thank you for what we're going to see today with Moses, that when our life seems like it may be in chaos, to us, God, that you are still in control and you're still working according to your plan. And so, God, we just love you and thank you for all that you're going to show us. And we just praise you that we each have the Holy Spirit, that every time we study your word, you can use it in our lives to sharpen us, make us more like you. And so we just ask that you would do that today. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, so just for introduction, we're going to be talking a little bit about everything that happened before Exodus 1:1. And in Exodus 1:1, it starts off with, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. And we talked about last week that Moses really assumes that we know all the Genesis stories. He's going to pick up right here with Israel being in Egypt. And one of the things that's really great for us is that the Egyptians were really good at maintaining their historical documents. So there's a lot that we know about the pharaohs of this day, and we're going to talk about some of that. And you can do your own research on this. Of course, this is very, very ancient history. So when we talk about dates and we talk about that kind of thing, there's always a couple different opinions about it. And so basically, most commentators believe in one of two date timelines. One is called the early Exodus and one is called the late Exodus. And you can read about that on your own. I'll give you this website again. This is always a great website to go to start. Is Got Questions is a great website to start at, and it's run by Logos Bible software, and it'll give you a good starting point. And it will often explain a couple of the different views about that. I'm going with an early Exodus date, and so much of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be lining up to that early Exodus date. So we're going to be talking about earlier pharaohs than if you accept the late Exodus date. Does that make sense? Because it's separated by like 200 years. I mean, it's a pretty big difference. And so when we get to the slides here about this group of pharaohs, I believe that the best evidence is that it was that group of pharaohs that Moses is talking about here. But one of the things we're going to talk about is Moses doesn't say who the pharaohs are. And that's really on purpose. And we'll talk about that when we get there. So let's just talk about how we're picking up here with Israel being in Egypt and all of these promises that God had already made. And if I was to say, or if anybody was to say, where in the world did the Hebrew people, or where did Israel, where did Jewish people come from, what would be your answer? Where did that begin?
Abraham.
The Abrahamic covenant. That's exactly right. That is when God went and decided to choose a people group for himself. And he went to Abraham. We read this in chapter 12, and we talked about this last week, and hopefully you did it in your homework. He came to Abraham, and he makes promises to Abraham. Now, he doesn't call it a covenant yet. It's not until chapter 15 that he comes and he cuts a covenant with Abraham. But he makes three promises to Abraham that are the three promises that we see when he comes to Isaac, and then when he comes to Jacob. It's always kind of, you can break them down into these three different promises. One is that the many descendants, and he uses many word pictures. Sometimes he'll say the sand, sometimes he'll say the stars, but he talks about them having many descendants. Also is always the land promise. There's this promise of this promised land of Canaan. And then the third is, we call it the seed promise, but it's really that all the families of the earth are going to be blessed by something that is going to be produced from Abraham's line. And we know that that, of course, is Jesus. And God promised that way back in the fall, and he now, in Genesis 3, and now here we are in Genesis 12, and God says to accomplish the fact of producing this seed, it's going to be through Abraham. So Abraham begins his journey in chapter 12, and when we study Genesis, we know that it was not a straight path, right? It was not a straight path to where God wanted him. It was very curvy, and Abraham didn't do everything right. He ended up in Egypt. Ended up lying to Pharaoh, giving Sarah his wife. I mean, just pretty much a train wreck. You have Sarah's plan with Hagar. Lots of things come into the way of that, but God stayed consistent. And one of the things we always say is that the Abrahamic covenant in chapter 17 in Genesis tells us this, is an everlasting, unconditional covenant. Meaning that there wasn't anything Abraham could have done that would have kept God from keeping these promises. And that this covenant is an everlasting covenant. That's what God calls it in chapter 17. And so that means that that covenant is still ongoing. And we see that in Genesis 15, when God comes and he cuts the covenant with Abraham. Where is Abraham? He's asleep, right? Why is he not the one walking between the pieces?
He's not the one to fulfill it.
Yeah, he's not even able to fulfill an everlasting covenant, right? He's not able to fulfill an everlasting, unconditional covenant. And the reason I'm going to bring that up a lot is because it is going to be contrasted to the covenant that we see God's people cut with him at Mount Sinai. And so it's going to be completely different, because there the people are going to have a part in the covenant cutting. But I want it to be like part of you to understand that Abraham was just a recipient of the covenant. His part was just, God just made it with him. And so, and when God came to him in Genesis 15 and cut the covenant with Abram at the time, he did say, now sometimes it's not going to look like you're going to have all of these promises, because in fact God says for 400 years you're going to be where? In a land that's not yours. You're going to be strangers. Yes.
With the 400 years.
Yes.
And you talked about the two versions.
Yes.
Doesn't the 400 years but one version
Yes.
walk correctly?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And again, it's I think it's 430 years if you go with the early date. Yep. And he even tells them in Genesis 15 though, that even that time that they're there, that they're going to come out with many possessions. And we're going to see that in this next week's homework. And so we look at that God comes and he renews that covenant with Isaac. He states the same thing: descendants, land, and seed. All the nations of the earth will be blessed. And Isaac stays there in the land of Canaan. God comes to Jacob and gives him the promises too. And that, of course, that was, he had his own journey, didn't he, Jacob? And the land, again, was part of that covenant that he made with Jacob. And Jacob is the one that, remember when he had that whole dream and he was struggling with God? It was at that point that God changed Jacob's name to Israel. In the same way that he changed Abram's name to Abraham, but it was very significant because of what Jacob's name meant and then what Israel's name meant. And he said, from Israel, we have all of those boys that are born, right? Kind of scoundrels, because what do, right? They sell their brother Joseph. And don't you, I mean, is it not just so amazing when you look? I just want you to see, because our lives are so much like this, that if we could get the helicopter view, right? This type of view of our lives, it would make so much more sense than it does when we're right in it. If Joseph, as he sat in the pit, was probably not thinking, oh yeah, I remember great-great-great-grandfather Abraham, it said that we were going to end up in Egypt. I'm sure God's going to use me to get his people to Egypt. Joseph didn't understand all that. He did understand enough to say, though, whatever you mean for harm, remember what he said to his brothers? Whatever you mean for harm for me, God means for good. So Joseph did understand, but God's going to use the meanness of Joseph's brothers to get God's people exactly where he needed them to be. And he had told them they were going to be there in Egypt. So we see Joseph end up in Egypt. We see that he ends up becoming very high up because he interprets the dreams and he tells them about the famine. And then again, we see famine in the land drive Jacob and the other brothers to Joseph, don't we? Again, God uses famine in the land to get God's people exactly where he needs them to be. And so we have that now Israel, Jacob, is in Egypt with the boys, and Joseph are there. And that's where we pick up in Exodus 1, that we see that here we have in Egypt with Jacob, and I love that it says these are the names of the sons of Israel, and then it refers to Jacob by name there, with Jacob, each of his household, and it gives the names of the boys, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. We'll be looking at these names and looking at these people and their tribes in detail later on. But they're going to be important in the story, and this is why Moses opens this book with these, listing out these tribes, listing out these names. And it says in verse 5, all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. So by the time Jacob and all the boys came with their wives and their children, and they came to Egypt, there were only 70 of them. And Joseph was already in Egypt. And why is that important? Because in verse 7, we see, by the way, verse 6, Joseph died, and all of his brothers and all of that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. And if you remember at the end of Genesis, Joseph and his brothers are given a good parcel of land. So they're out there increasing in number. And it's very interesting when you look at the history of Egypt, that right about the time that we were opening up the book of Exodus, it says, in fact, verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, all the way through, king and pharaoh are used interchangeably. Pharaoh is more the title to the person, where king is the office that he held, but it's the same thing. They were all called pharaohs, and but king is the office, so he's the ruler of the area. Very interesting that historically there was a non-Egyptian people group called the Hyksos who had just taken over Egypt for about 100 years, right before Exodus opens. And what that means is it would give us this understanding of why this Pharaoh is so worried about these Jewish Hebrew people, because they've just been taken over by a non-Egyptian group of people, right? And so Pharaoh says, we can't let these Hebrews get any stronger or any, they're growing to the place where they could take us over or they could join our enemy and we could lose power again. So this is a brand new Pharaoh that takes over, who doesn't know Joseph. Now, he would have known about Joseph, yes.
Are you saying the king was one from the Hyksos people?
No,
Okay.
This new Pharaoh's just taken over from, they just conquered them historically.
They conquered the Hyksos.
Yes.
Okay.
And they've just taken control back of Egypt. And in fact, I have this little thing here with the pharaohs, and we can just go to that. This is where I probably spent about 3 hours researching all of this. Big gap of time, because I was totally fascinated. There's some just very interesting historical work that you can do. I'll just make mention of it. Let's just look at this chart first of all. But when Exodus opens, again, this is using the early date of 1446 as the Exodus, that there was a brand new Egyptian pharaoh who took over from the Hyksos people, named Amnihotep, or however you would say that, and he governed for only 21 years. And so what happens is that, and by the way, Moses is pointing out for us that it really doesn't matter who the pharaoh is. The pharaoh could be anybody. That their names are not even recorded for us, but then the midwives' names are. Because Moses is basically, it doesn't matter which pharaoh is in charge, God's in charge, is kind of the idea, that he doesn't even name them. And because verse 15, no matter which dates you look at, would be a different pharaoh. And so that's why pharaohs are coming and going in this story, but they all have the same mission. And that is to persecute these Hebrew people because they are a threat to the Egyptians. And the reason I bring that up is because we may think, well, why are they a threat? Well, because think about this, anytime in that day and age, anytime a people group would be getting bigger and bigger and stronger, there was always a chance that they would join up with the Midianites, right? Who we're going to read about in a minute, and both of them come and conquer Egypt and take it away from the Egyptian people. So that's really what's motivating these pharaohs and motivating these taskmasters to conquer these Hebrew people, because they want to put them down. Because historically, they're worried that this people group is going to get too big and powerful for them. So, and just while we're on this, because I'm not going to talk about it a lot in the future. I mean, in the few minutes in a few minutes when we get to it. But it's really interesting that there is the son of Thutmose the first, would be Thutmose the second, who only rules for 13 years. So, when we're reading this, we're thinking this is all happening within 30 days. And it's not. There's years and years and years in between these verses. Does that make sense? So like, this is what I'm saying. Between verse 8 and 15 could be 20 years. We're reading it, we're kind of thinking that it's very happening much quicker than it is. I do know that's not a word, by the way. But what I think is really fascinating, and this is true Egyptian history, by the way, that Thutmose II only ruled for 13 years. And he had a son and a daughter that co-reigned together. And her name was Hatshepsut, and many believe that that is the Egyptian daughter that adopted Moses. And that her and her brother, if you look there at how long they reigned together, Thutmose, if you look at it there, she actually takes reign earlier than he does because she was older. But then he comes into power and he eventually kicks her out. Now, when we get to the Pharaoh that wants to kill Moses, that we're talking about his uncle there. We're talking about the Pharaoh that is Thutmose III. When he leaves for Midian, Thutmose III is the one who is in control at that point. And Moses is 40 years old at this point. And so I want you to kind of think through, we'll talk about it when we get there, but why would Moses have been a threat to him? Because he's in the family, right? He may get control. And so Thutmose III, this is why Moses, it kind of seems like an overreaction on his part that he is so afraid that he immediately goes out. But there was a lot of political drama going on there so she's an interesting character to look her up there. I mean, they have what they think she looks like because they found all kinds of statues and different things of her. So anyhow, if you want to look that up, you can lose a couple hours like I did researching all of that Egyptian history. But I think it's really fascinating. And I'm just going to say this too, and then I'm not going to come back to it. What's really interesting, if you look at this timeline, is that right after the Exodus, history tells us that two things are true. Number one, that the Egyptians are conquered by a foreign people group. And interestingly, they can't put up a very strong army to defend themselves. Why would that be, y'all? Yeah, they all drowned, right? And the second thing, seriously, you can read this for yourself. There is accounts that when they get to Egypt, this people group that conquers Egypt after the Exodus, that there is account that for some reason, there's not a lot of wealth in the city. And so I'm telling you, you could look these facts up. All of that is recorded for us in non-biblical history. So it's super interesting for you can look all that up if you want. And I just found it super interesting.
Is there also that same type of thing that happens after the later?
No,
Okay.
there isn't. There isn't. So it's kind of what swayed me to go with the early. Because I like to know for sure, but I don't know for sure. I just give it my best stab at like what lines up, I think, with the Bible the best. And then it sure is nice when you have a couple history type of things. So let's look. That's all we're going to say about that, because all of that is extra biblical and we want to stay in the Bible. What we do know is that in verse 8, that we have this new Pharaoh over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And we do know that he is afraid of the people of Israel, that they are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And so, at the point before verse 11, they definitely would have been your lower class even. I mean, the reason why he says fight against us and escape from the land, the reason why he doesn't want them to escape from the land is who's going to do all the work. Because they were all paid laborers, and they would have been really helping the Egyptians run their land. And now Egypt's going to turn them from paid laborers into slaves. And we're going to see that they do that to crush this people, to try to get control over them. So the Egyptians set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built Pharaoh's store cities. And the more they were oppressed, though, the more they multiplied. And the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So it's not just the Pharaoh. All the Egyptian people are in dread of the people of Israel. And the more they put them down, the more they grow. And so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves.
Sarah,
Yes.
I don't know. I don't remember my history all that well, but would they have used them as laborers to build the pyramid?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those two big cities, which they still have the archaeological evidence of those cities there on the Nile River. Yeah. And we see that the reason why they're made slaves is really a fear-based reason. They're afraid of them, so they want to put them down and make them slaves. And the more they oppress them, the more they grow. And verse 15, so again, verses 1 through 14 is telling us something that's happening over 25 years. And they're still growing and doing well. So the next Pharaoh says, well, Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shipra and the other Puah. When you serve as a midwife to Hebrew women, see them on the birth stool. If it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. And I love verse 17. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, and let the male children live. And the Pharaoh comes up with this new plan. Hebrew midwives would have been women, which this makes so much sense, is that you would be a midwife either when you were older and past your childbearing years, or if you couldn't have children of your own. And it makes sense because if you're nursing a baby or you're a mother yourself, you can't get up and move, right? Go help all of these women who are needing help having their babies. And so these midwives, we're going to see here so sweetly, seem to be women who couldn't have children of their own. And I just thought, how terrible must it have been for them to not be able to have children of their own and have to go and just be the midwives for all the women who are having children. And these midwives, we see their names there. They're Hebrew women who feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. And not only did they not do when the king of Egypt calls the midwives and says, "Why have you done this and let the male children live?" The midwives lie to Pharaoh, don't they? And say, "The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." And so all of us who had really long birth stories were wishing that was true about us, right? But what they're saying is we can't, and this is the whole plan. They would go and take the child, and the mother wouldn't know. She would just say the child wasn't born correctly, or you know what I mean, or once that child was born and in the mother's hands, you have a different problem. Then you have to take the baby from the mother, and we're going to see that happen because they're going to have to ramp up the plan, aren't they? But at this point, he's just saying, "I don't want the Hebrew people to know we're doing this." So he comes to the midwives and he says, "This is what I want you to do." And what's interesting, if you think about this, is he said it to all the Hebrew midwives. So there were Hebrew midwives who were doing what Pharaoh asked. Because look at the wording. He says to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was Shiphrah and the other Puah. They're not the only Hebrew midwives, but they're two who, in spite of what everybody else was doing, all the other Hebrew midwives, they say, "No, we're going to fear God and not fear man, and not fear the king of Egypt." Even to the point that when they're called before him, they tell Pharaoh, they come up with an excuse. And in verse 20, "So God dwelt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families."
I had not noticed that.
No.
Such a sweet,
I had not noticed.
sweet thing that these women were able to have children themselves and would have a family. And that, you know, it's so interesting that Moses names these women like they're important, and they're just little midwives, right? That would not be high up on and Moses names them because they're important. They're women who feared God and didn't fear Pharaoh. And you can't help but think of all the people who lied to the German government to hide the Jewish people back in the day of the Holocaust. And here we have that really happening for us in Exodus 1. In verse 22, Pharaoh commanded all his people then. So at first he just goes to the Hebrew midwives, but now Pharaoh's plan is this is not working. So now he says to all the Egyptians, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." So he ramps up his plan. And I have a statement there that the kings of the world cannot nullify God's promise. And God made a promise in Genesis 15 that those people would come out victorious out of Egypt, and we're watching that plan come to fruition. Now, there's a lot of pain and suffering on the ground going on. And this is what I mean by we get the helicopter view Moses is giving us of the situation, and we can see so clearly God's in control. But there were a lot of women who saw their sons be killed. And we're going to see God's going to end up using that exact thing against the Egyptians in the future. So we're going to really see this firstborn, this whole importance of the son come through the scripture. And by the way, it's not saying that the men are more important. What he's trying to do is get rid of the ability to be able to conceive, the ability to be able to propagate the land. And so we have chapter 2 opens up that there is a man and a woman from the Levite tribe. We'll talk about that later. Why is it important that Moses was a Levite? We'll talk about that later when we get to later chapters. And she conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. So, by the way, when are Jewish children circumcised? 8th day, right? And Genesis 17 tells us that. And Moses would have already been circumcised. Here he is for 3 months. He would have been circumcised like any other Hebrew son. And he lives with his mother for 3 months. And, you know, at some point their lungs get a little stronger and it's harder to hide him. And she could hide him no more. So she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river, by the riverbank. And it's so interesting, the details that Moses gives us about this basket. And I'll just make mention of this. I'm sure you've probably heard this at some place. But this basket that is made, even what it is daubed with, and you know that word daubed, right? It means, what is she doing with that? She's making it waterproof. She's using this bitumen and pitch to make like a sap, right? To make it waterproof for this baby. Because if not, you make a basket, what is basket gonna do? Just, right? There, it's interesting, if you go back to Genesis 6, God gave Noah some of these very particular instructions of how to daub the wood that he uses to make the ark. And it is fascinating that the only time where it says she took for him a basket, that word basket in the Hebrew is tebah, T-E-B-A-H. Is that an A? My glasses aren't as good as my contacts. In the Hebrew language, and the only other usage of that word is in the Genesis account with Noah. And that literally this basket becomes an ark. It becomes a place of rescue for Moses and figuratively for God's people. That basket ends up being a way of deliverance, very similar to Noah's ark being a way of deliverance for his family. And I have never heard some of the details of this story, that his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. And you know that, I'm sure that was the mom's plan, right? Like, I can't watch the basket because it'll be too suspicious. But just a young girl, just a girl on the bank. And so the sister is watching what happens to Moses. And think about the perfect timing here. That any other Egyptian woman could have found him. But look at the perfect timing that it says, now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. And just think of how God works all of that. Like if someone had stopped her and talked to her right? And or maybe she didn't feel good that day and she ended up not going down to the river. Think of how different this story would be. But that God is in control, orchestrating this, that just at the perfect time, Pharaoh's daughter comes down. And why is that important? Because no one else would have been able to choose to raise the Hebrew child. If any other Egyptian woman said, I think I'm going to keep this Hebrew child for myself, they would have said, no, you can't do that. But this is Pharaoh's daughter. She has a lot more power to do what she wants to do. So really, she's probably the only one who could have saved Moses' life here. And she is the one who comes down to bathe at the river while her young women walk beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the baby was crying. And hearing that cry, she took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. How would she have known for sure that it was a Hebrew child? He's circumcised. That's absolutely right. And do you not think, as Moses grew up, I mean, he definitely knew he was different. By the way, they were not as modest as we are today. They did a lot of like bathing, you know, all the men would bathe together at this one place, right? Moses knew he was different, is my point. And why is that? We're going to see. It's for some reason, I feel like in the movie, it kind of seems like all of a sudden he figures out he's Hebrew. But he always knew he was Hebrew. He always knew. And that's why, in fact, I think what Stephen says, we're going to read it in a minute in Acts, it was that one day he decided to go see his brothers, meaning the other Hebrew people. And then this is like so interesting to me that I never noticed that Moses' sister said to Pharaoh's daughter. Now, y'all, this is a Hebrew girl speaking to one of the most powerful people in the land. The courage that it would take for her, the timing, and because we see that she's watching this happen, somehow this sister closes the distance, right? To the point that she can actually speak to her. Y'all see what I mean? Like she's all in to helping Moses. And the courage for her to speak and look at her plan. I missed this the first, probably every time I've studied this before until I did it, slowed down and really read it, that it's his sister who says, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Because an Egyptian woman, a nursemaid who was Egyptian, would in no way nurse a Hebrew child. And so the sister comes up with this great plan. Let me go get a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby, because he's Hebrew, for you. And don't you love it? Who does she go get? She goes and gets Moses' mother, who, if you know anything about nursing and all of that, you know, her milk supply would have definitely been still there, right? And so she goes, I love this. Pharaoh's daughter, so the girl goes and gets Moses' mother, and can you imagine, Moses' mother probably couldn't even believe that it was working out like this. Moses' mother comes to Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh's daughter says this, take this child away and nurse him for me. And then what does she end up even getting? She gets paid to nurse her own baby, right? So literally, I mean, I want y'all to see this from Moses' mom's point of view. Moses' mom is literally putting Moses in that basket thinking she'll never see him again. And she gets the incredible privilege and honor of spending probably 3 more years with him. That's about how long they would have nursed back then. And they were really big about this, that, you know, they would exempt women from the Hebrew fasts during their nursing time and everything, because they really believed that this was what was best for the babies. And so most people believe Moses spent that first at least 3 years with his family. Just think about Moses' mother speaking Hebrew to him for 3 years. And that time that he had with his family. And amazingly, Moses' mom gets paid to nurse her own baby. So the woman took the child and nursed him. Did y'all know all that? Had y'all noticed all of that? I did not. So crazy. Verse 10 says, when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. It's interesting, the name Moses just really means child of or born of. It doesn't really depict water. In fact, if you look at some of those on that chart, some of the ends of those names, it has Moses in it, because it's really saying he's the child of Thut, or the child of, and so Moses is the child of, and Moses would have had this Hebrew knowledge, and he would have had Egyptian knowledge, because he would have been raised as an Egyptian. And so let's look in Acts 7. I just want us to get a little bit of this picture, because I think Stephen tells us some really interesting things about Moses that we don't necessarily get. So if we were to read a little bit further, we're going to see, and we're going to read it here too, that Moses is going to, in fact, let's just read it real fast in Exodus. It says, one day when Moses had grown up, so everybody, all commentators believe Moses is about 40 years old here. So he's not 20. It sounds like he's 20. But one day when Moses was an adult is what it really means here. Moses was about 40 years old. He went out to his people and looked on their burdens. Now here's the thing. Moses is living in Egypt. He knows he's Hebrew. For 40 years he's watched his people, right, be slaves. But we understand that there all of a sudden becomes a time, right, where you really see something differently that's maybe been happening your entire life. And he really sees the burden, the slavery. He probably was burdened about it up to this point. But the final straw for him is when he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And so he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he strikes down the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. Now, I think it's fascinating what Stephen tells us Moses is thinking at this point, because he adds something to the story that we don't get in this chapter. So let's talk about context-wise where we are in the book of Acts. The church is born in the book of Acts, right? Pentecost has come, and really the church is all kept right now in Jerusalem. And Stephen was one of the very first deacons, right? And he was chosen to serve. And it tells us that he had devoted himself to prayer and to the ministry of the word. And Stephen is just one of these great characters in the New Testament that God is going to use something terrible that happens to Stephen to do what? What what happens in chapter 7 that changes everything? Yeah, he drives out all the Christians out of Jerusalem. Because what happens with the stoning of Stephen is they get very fearful and they travel all over and the church spreads. And so Stephen is here in front of all the Pharisees. Paul even says Paul would have been one of those there. And the high priest says to Stephen, verse 1, "Are these things so?" Asking him about Jesus. And Stephen starts at the very beginning, doesn't he? "Brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham." And he goes on and gives the whole history of how God was working through. And who is he talking to here? Hebrew people. He's talking to Pharisees, to the high priests. He's talking to Jewish Hebrew people. So look at verse 17. He says, this is what Stephen is saying to them. "But as the time of the promise drew near," what promise is he talking about there? That's exactly right, that they would come out of Egypt. He says, "which God had granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. He dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. And at this time, Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight. And he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. And when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds." Now, we'll talk about this more next week, because one of the big excuses that Moses uses is what? He can't speak well. And we don't know exactly. It's one of the things I'm going to be really fascinated to wonder if he had a speech impediment or whatever. But Moses would have known Hebrew. He also would have known Egyptian. And Stephen tells us that he was mighty in words and deeds. And when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And we're going to see in this next week's work that when he meets Aaron, right? And in fact, when even God says, "I'm going to give you Aaron," Moses doesn't say, "Who's Aaron?" Does he? He knows who Aaron is. So I'm not sure how all that plays out, but when you see Moses and Aaron reunite in this next week's work, it is obvious that they know each other. And so Stephen tells us that it was at a point, and when he was 40, that it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. Now look at verse 25. He supposed, meaning Moses supposed, assumed, was thinking that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand. But they did not understand. Tell me what verse 25 just told us. What did Moses understand?
He was going to be, maybe he was the guy.
Yes.
Who was gonna do it. I have a question about that, because
If you didn't hear her, she said the first part quiet. So
Maybe he was the guy that was going to be
absolutely,
leading
he
them.
understood.
So we know that for 40 years he was with the Egyptians.
Right.
And he was raised in all their ways.
Yeah.
But surely he had to have been
Right.
visiting with the Hebrews too to know how to speak their language, to know their God, to
Absolutely.
know all of that.
And know
because-
Aaron.
And know Aaron.
Mhm.
Because
Absolutely.
when he goes to Midian, they're
Right.
not
Right.
They're not believers. They're not Hebrews. They don't
Exactly.
have all that history, right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Do you know the age difference between Aaron and Moses?
I do not. Maybe we're going to find that out, but I don't know it right now.
He wouldn't even known the promise, would
Yeah.
he have? I mean, he wouldn't have unless he had.
He
Had
had to
known.
have.
He
Yeah,
had
that's
to
how
have known.
Yeah.
He
I mean,
had to have known the
you know
promises.
God deals with him for that 40 years
Right.
in Midian too before he goes.
I
to
just
lead
think
people out, but
This verse right here is fascinating to me, that it says that he thought that his brothers, he thought the other Hebrew people would understand what obviously he knew, that God was giving them salvation by Moses' hand, not God's hand here. That he thought his brothers would understand. So somehow, you're absolutely right. Moses is knowing the Hebrew culture, knowing the Hebrew language. He's knowing, because in a minute we're going to see that he goes and talks to the elders, the Hebrew elders. We're going to see, if you haven't gotten that far, that's the first people he talks to, are the Hebrew elders. And so he knows the Hebrew language, he knows the Egyptian language, and somehow Moses, Stephen tells us this, has an understanding that God has, I think of that thing that Esther says, I was born for such a time as this. Somehow God's going to use me to be a way of escape for his people, to be a deliverer. Yes, Cheryl.
So if I'm Moses' mother,
Mhm.
and I know the history that God said you will be in a foreign land for 400 years,
Right?
it's coming up to the end of the 400 years. My child got saved and put in a basket, and he's living in the Pharaoh's house.
Yeah.
I mean, that could have easily been a jump that he was even,
All right.
if he had contact with.
I think
yeah, surely
Moses
she's
had.
speaking that into his life.
Yeah,
you know.
Moses has an understanding, and Stephen tells us that he understands, and then he's surprised that the other Hebrew people are like, like, why, yeah, Janae?
I was just gonna add in, Aaron is 3 years older than Moses.
3 years older.
You would've known
Chapter
him
7,
even
verse
older.
7.
Yeah,
Chapter
Sarah.
7, verse 7 says,
Says.
he was 83 and Moses was 80. when they-
thank you very much, y'all. 3,
And maybe it jumped out at me,
Mhm.
40 years.
yeah,
They didn't believe. They had to go in the wilderness
Mm.
for 40 more years.
mhm,
He's 40.
Again, he runs away. 40 years later,
yeah,
God brings him back.
yeah, absolutely.
Magic number there.
That 40 years, we're going to see that repeated a lot. And it does make us understand a little bit how Moses thought, I'm going to rescue my people at 40 years old. He's 40, and he says, I'm going to rescue my people. I'm going to kill this Egyptian here. It's going to start now. And then everything goes topsy-turvy, and he ends up having to leave Egypt. Probably very disillusioned that maybe I've misunderstood, right? Because then he has to go and leave Egypt. Yes, Betsy.
Well, I kind of look at it and think that he may have had an idea of God's plan, but God hasn't spoken to him yet.
Correct.
And he's trying to do it on his own power.
Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
he
And
needed to
God's
go
not done
away.
with them yet, right?
Right.
It reminds me a little bit of Joseph, telling his dream to his brothers. We always think Joseph maybe should have kept his mouth shut, but if he had, his brothers probably wouldn't have hated him so bad and probably wouldn't have sold him into slavery. So, like, you look at it again from this high view that God even used Joseph being, a little braggadocious to end up driving the story to get it all exactly. And that's the thing, is that my life sometimes, and I know your life, seems like a bunch of random, things. And God has this timing in our lives. I really believe that, to fulfill the plan and purpose that he has for us. And we, like Moses, sometimes at the time we want to do it, right? Want to do what we think God wants us to do. And sometimes he says, not yet. I don't want you to do it in your own.
And you're never too old, because he was 80 years old.
Absolutely. And you're never too old. And look, let's read just a little bit more of what Stephen says. Really, this next thing is pretty much the same thing, where on the following day, Moses appeared to them as they were quarreling. And them are just Hebrew brothers, and we're going to see that in a minute, and tried to reconcile them, saying, men, you're brothers. Why do you wrong each other? How many times have you moms said that to your two boys, right? I've said that a lot. When I'm dead and gone, all you're going to have is each other, right? Be nice to each other. But the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him aside and said, who made you a ruler and judge over us? And really, for this Hebrew person, he didn't understand. He's like, you're Egyptian. Why are you telling us what to do? You're a half-breed. You're Hebrew and Egyptian. Are you going to rule over us now? And then he says, do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And Moses realizes, uh-oh, everybody knows. And at this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. Now, we'll come back and read a little bit more there in Acts, but let's go and see a couple more details that we get in Exodus. Is indeed, verse 11, we already read that, and verse 12, we read that he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. And when he went out the next day, behold, there were 2 Hebrews that were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? And he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you've killed the Egyptian? And then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. And yes, it was known, because guess who hears about it? Pharaoh. Verse 15. When Pharaoh heard of it, when Pharaoh heard that Joseph had killed the Egyptian to defend his Hebrew brothers, think about this on Pharaoh's point of view. You've got this half family member, it's been adopted into your family, but that Pharaoh knows that he's Hebrew, but he's raised as an Egyptian. He's living in the palace, living as the Egyptian, living as a prince, right? And Pharaoh is like, if he turns on us, he'll be a great leader for his people. And so Pharaoh in particular says, I got to get rid of Moses. And he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he went down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. And they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. By the way, this is just a whole side note. When I was reading this, I thought, I think Moses is an Enneagram 8. If you know anything about those, if you don't know anything about the Enneagram, that will not matter to you at all. But isn't it interesting? Because what does Moses do? We're going to see this over and over again. He defends the underdog. He gets indignant for people who are being hurt. And so this is the second time. The first time we saw it with the Egyptians, and now you're like, listen, you're an outsider. Can't you, mind your own business? but he sees these women being persecuted. And I think these women probably face this every day. They would go together and the shepherds would give it, because water was so scarce at the time, that here these women come and the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. And when they came home to their father, Reuel, which, by the way, in a minute we're going to see that his name is Jethro. But if you look up this Reuel, I think I have that on the slide, that it's really a title, friend of God, which doesn't mean he's not a friend of Jehovah. It's just he would be a priest. So that's why the priestly name is Reuel. Does that make sense? Sort of like Pharaoh means he's the leader. His actual name, we're going to see in verse 1 of chapter 3, is Jethro. And so the girls get home quicker than normal. And he says, "How is it that you've come home so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." And he said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. Again, verse 20 and verse 21 are years and years of time. Moses is brought there, and you'll see this interesting thing throughout the entire book of Exodus. I'll just make mention of it now, how strangers are dealt with here and how God honors that. And we see that Moses is a stranger that this family takes in, and Moses is content to dwell with the man. We're going to see in a minute that he becomes the shepherd, really, of the flocks, and that this man even gives Moses his daughter Zipporah. And she gave birth to a son, and we only hear about one son here, right? So this is the firstborn son, but Stephen just told us he had two sons. She gave birth to a son, and by the way, we're going to talk about that next week with this whole story of Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." And that name Gershom really is a tip to the hat. You know, he's tipping his hat really to his father-in-law and the fact that he is in exile, a stranger in the land, and he's been taken care of there. Verse 23, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Now it's interesting. It says that God remembered. We've talked about that it is impossible for God to forget. But in Moses's, and by the way, it says something very similar in verse 11 about Moses, that Moses looked on their burdens and decided to do something, right? And then remember in Stephen, it says that he felt something in his heart. And so really God has been watching what's been happening, and there comes a time where he says, it's now time for me to put into play my covenant that I made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And we're going to fly through this last chapter. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And we're going to look at a map But this is the same mountain we're going to see over and over and over again. This is Mount Sinai that Moses is at. We'll look at a map next week, but that is why it's called the Mountain of God, because that mountain is going to be very important in the story. Very important place.
Question.
Yes,
So is Horeb, synonym for,
yeah, Horeb is that land around it.
okay.
Yes. And we'll even see in a minute that he's in the wilderness, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And we're going to see here that Moses is out with the flock, and he looks, and there is this bush that's on fire, which wouldn't be a crazy thing. Like, that's not unusual. But what is unusual is it's not being consumed. And so Moses may have looked at this bush for a while, right? Maybe an hour, maybe a day in the distance. And Moses said, I'll turn aside to see this great sight. When it says turn aside, we would use that language if we were turning away, but we're going to see here that Moses turns toward it, doesn't he? So he leaves what he's doing, being a shepherd to the flock, and he turns aside and walks to this bush. And not because it's on fire, but why it's not being burnt. It's on fire, yet not being burnt. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see. Isn't that interesting? That it says that God is there at that burning bush, and it's going to be God himself who speaks to Moses here. And God does this manifestation of this burning bush to attract Moses to come to him. And I guess I just never noticed that it said, and when God saw that Moses indeed came to it, when he turned aside to come closer. So as he's walking up, God calls out to him out of the bush and says, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he wants Moses to understand that this encounter is going to be unlike anything else you've experienced. And I want you to take your sandals often represented your identity as a human, your identity as like mankind. And he says, Moses, take your sandals off, because right here you are standing on holy ground. And God said to him, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses would have known what all of that meant. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. We're going to talk about this a lot more in the future. But I think it's very interesting. Every time God describes this land, he describes it good and bad, the good and the bad. He says, yes, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, but it has all these Hittites there, right? all of these people in the land. And God always intended to conquer those people, to give his people the land of milk and honey. But I just love from the very beginning, God describes it and says, yes, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, but there are people on it, and it's going to be scary, right? And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I've also seen the oppression with which Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? It's interesting that not only is Moses questioning who he is, right? Who am I to do this? But he really is also questioning God's plan here. It's not just who am I, but who am I to go to Pharaoh? Like, can't we sneak out in the middle of the night, right? Like, but this is how God wants to accomplish it. And God says, but I will be with you. Even when you don't know who you are, I will be with you. And which, by the way, that should have been the end of this conversation. We shouldn't have like a whole chapter of Moses going on and on and on about it. But I will be with you, and this will be a sign for you that I've sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So that's the sign that God has been with them, is you're going to go, people are going to come out, and I'm going to be here, and we're going to see that just shortly. And Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And remember, last time he tried to do this on his own, right? They pushed against him. And so Moses has a concern here, and God said to Moses, I am who I am. We're going to look at that next week. I think it's day 1 of your homework. So we're not going to talk about that today. And he said, say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. By the way, I think he even did this in this week's homework. We're going to see this is exactly what Moses does. Is the first step after he gets with Aaron is he goes to the elders of the people. And he indeed says, and God says, I promise that I'll bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, but a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, isn't that interesting? I never noticed that the elders of Israel go with Moses. And I never noticed this either, that what the original plan was not that they were going to just let my people go, right? That the original plan was, we're just going to go for 3 days. And he says, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, this is what God is telling Moses to tell the elders to tell the Pharaoh, okay? The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. So the original plan was just that the elders would go for 3 days journey to worship God. But God says to Moses, but I know the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by my mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he'll let you go. And this next week, we're going to read about all those wonders. And God is telling Moses ahead of time that this king, this Pharaoh, is not going to let you go. He is going to have a hard heart. He's not going to let you go. And we're going to see that happen all the way through. And it says, and I will give this people, my people, favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold, jewelry, and for clothing. And you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. So you shall plunder the Egyptians. So we will pick up next week in Exodus 4, verse 1. And as we get to this story about Zipporah in verse 25 of this chapter, there is this story. I just want you to think about how important we've seen the son, how important the son has been. And even as we're thinking through what happens there at the end of chapter 4, if you know what is the final sign that is going to get Pharaoh to give in? His son, right? And the Egyptian sons. And so we're going to talk about that more, but consider that as part, when you're looking at the story of Zipporah, why was it important that Gershom be circumcised before he gets to Egypt? And if you have no idea, if you haven't read chapter 4, you have no idea what I'm talking about, you will when you get there, I promise. But it'll give us a little more understanding about that story. So excited. We have so much fun stuff we're going to look at. Can't wait to get to Passover and just all the amazing things. And so we're going to spend some time in chapter 5 and chapter 4 with Moses not being the best leader. And what I love is that in spite of who Moses is, God's going to use him. And we've seen that over and over and over again. So even though we don't know who we are, even though we don't know what we can accomplish, God has a plan for each one of us of what he wants to do in our lives. Let me pray for us. God, we look at this story that seems like just a story of circumstance. But God, we can see you just with your gentle hand just guiding each step of the way. God, I thank you for the courage of Moses' sister to speak, to allow Moses' mother to be able to continue to raise him. And can you imagine what a gift it was to her to have those 3 years with him? And we just thank you for how you work in our lives and how things may seem random or not going our way, God, but we know that somehow you are working those things out for good for us. We just thank you for that. God, we thank you for choosing Moses in spite of his weakness, and choosing Moses not because he was perfect, but because you could accomplish through Moses your plan. And so, God, we just thank you for all we're going to see. And God, I thank you that you keep your promises, and that the promises that you've made to us in the new covenant, you will keep in the same way that we see you keeping your promises here. That your eye is indeed on your people, and it may seem like things are out of control, but God, we know that you have your people in mind, you have your eye on them, and you know your people. And we've seen that in this story, and we know that that is true today. So we just thank you for that, and I just pray your blessings on these women, God, that you would multiply the time that they spend in your word, God, that you would just give that back to them tenfold, and God, that they would just learn more about you and be more like you as a result. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.